They said she was cursed, Dot. The word was never spoken aloud. Not in church, not at the mercantile, not even in the hush of twilight on porch steps. But it hung in the air like smoke, clinging to her skirts, trailing behind her boots, curling. In the silence between greetings that never came, Miriam's husband had left her after 3 stillbirths. The last one near tore her apart, and when the midwife found only silence in the cradle, he walked out the same night, said nothing, just took his saddle and a rifle. Folks said it was a matter of fate, that some women were born dry, like scorched earth. Dot, she stayed, not because there was anything left to stay for, but because leaving would have meant she had somewhere to go. Every Sunday she sat alone in the pew near the back, hands folded like folded wings, eyes fixed on a God who never answered. Mothers turned their children's heads when she passed. Men looked through her like she was made of fog. The shopkeeper always gave her eggs from the back, smaller, cracked ones, as if to say, "This is what you deserve." One night, a stone shattered her window. No one claimed it. No one had to. The next morning, she swept the glass in silence, her bare feet leaving no prints on the dusty floor. She lit a fire, though the stove barely caught anymore. Something in her had gone cold, long before the stone, long before the last cradle. And yet she tended the soil. Not much, just a small patch behind the house. The land was tired, like her. But she turned it anyway, with brittle hands, as if to say, "I am still here." That spring brought nothing new, until the day she found a stranger collapsed near the creek, blood dark on his side, skin sun-worn and shivering. A man, half-conscious, barely breathing, wrapped in the shadows of old war paint and scars that told stories no one else dared carry. She dragged him home. No one saw. No one cared. Not yet. She did not speak to him for 2 days. The fever took hold, and he muttered in Cherokee, words like wind through dead leaves, soft, mournful, lost. She understood none of it, yet something in his voice uncoiled in her chest. A rhythm she remembered from lullabies never sung. His face was lean, hollowed from hunger and pain. The wound in his side smelled of rust and rain-soaked iron. She cleaned it with what little she had, boiled water, strips from a nightgown she no longer wore. Silence. Miriam moved around him like a ghost, quiet, careful, not from fear. She wasn't afraid. She'd lived too long with nothing to lose. In the morning light, his eyes opened, dark and sharp, like obsidian. He didn't speak, just watched her, not with suspicion, not with pity, just recognition, as if he'd seen her before in another life, or maybe he knew her kind of emptiness. She set a tin cup of broth beside him, then stepped away. No gesture, no words. He took it with trembling hands, drinking slowly, never breaking his gaze. That night, she sat by the fire, turning a threadbare shawl in her lap. Her fingers moved, but her mind wandered elsewhere, to the baby she'd buried beneath the sycamore, to the sound of rain hitting the roof that night, to her husband's boots on the floor as he walked out. She had not cried in years. Even now, with a stranger bleeding in her bed, she felt nothing she could name, just that old ache behind her ribs, the one that reminded her she was still alive. The next day, she found a faded ribbon under the bed, pale blue, meant for a child that never breathed. She held it for a moment, then placed it in the drawer without a sound. When she returned, he was sitting up, his brow slick with sweat. He tried to speak, failed. She handed him a piece of charcoal and a scrap of SACKCLOTH. With a shaky hand. He wrote just one word, enough. She stared at it. Then, without thinking, she whispered, "I never was." His gaze softened, and something passed between them. Not forgiveness, not understanding, just Permission Dot to be broken, Dot to remain. He never told her his name, not at first. For days, he spoke in low fragments, mostly in Cherokee, sometimes in English, just enough to ask for water or gesture toward the firewood. Miriam didn't ask questions. Questions required answers, and she had learned to live without them. He moved like a man who had lived through fire. His left arm bore a long burn scar, old and jagged, stretching from shoulder to wrist. His right leg dragged slightly when he walked, as though the land itself tried to pull him back. He stayed in the shed behind the house once he could stand, fixed the door that wouldn't close right, chopped wood without being asked, sat in the field long after sundown, watching the horizon like he expected it to betray him. She watched him through the window, but never lingered. Dot. It was a strange sort of peace, not warm, not soft, but steady, like the hush between two storms. Some nights, he sang under his breath, voice low and rough as gravel over creek water. The songs had no melody, she knew, but something in them made her eyes sting. Not from the sound, but the stillness it stirred in her. She left food at his door. He left stones by hers, river-worn, round, smooth. Each morning, a different one. No explanation. Then one day, after she watered the garden and turned to go, she found something else on her doorstep, a small bundle of sage and cedar bound. In thread. She touched it, gently, as if it might vanish. That night, as dusk painted the sky with bruised lilac, she stepped outside and sat beside him for the first time. No words. Just the sound of wind through dry grass, and the crackle of the fire he'd built between them. He passed her a tin cup filled with something dark and bitter. She drank. He pointed to the sky, then to the earth, then placed his hand over his chest. She nodded, not because she understood, but because it felt like the only answer. Later, as the fire sank low, he looked at her and whispered, almost like a confession. They burned my village, said we were less than ghosts. She met his eyes. They said I wasn't a woman, she replied. They sat that way until the coals turned cold. They fell into rhythm without ever meaning to. She would milk the goat before sunrise, and he would split the kindling while the fog still clung to the hills. Their footsteps echoed in the morning stillness, side by side, but never overlapping. Some days he'd trail behind her in the garden, pressing his thumb into the soil, nodding when it felt right. Other days she'd sit near the barn while he mended the fence, needle in hand, stitching tears that didn't belong to fabric alone. They rarely touched, but silence lived easier between them than it ever had between her and any man. Once, after a long day of hauling stones from the field, she returned to find a new row of green just beneath the window, sprigs of mint already lifting their heads toward the sun. He never said it was him. She never asked, but the smell reminded her of the time before loss had turned her womb into a graveyard. One morning, she caught him watching her hang laundry. The wind took her scarf and tossed it toward the creek. He moved to retrieve it, but she shook her head. Let it go. Let it float. He understood. That afternoon, they sat beneath the cottonwood in shared silence. A bird landed near his boot. He didn't flinch. She noticed his hands, calloused, steady, brushing the dirt beside him like he was remembering something that hurt. She wanted to ask, but didn't. That night it rained. Not hard, just enough to whisper against the roof, tapping like fingers asking to be let in. She didn't light a fire, just lay on the cot, listening. Across the room, his breath was slow even, not asleep, just waiting. The next morning, the hills were wrapped in mist. She stood at the edge of the porch, arms crossed against the chill. He came up behind her, placed something in her palm, a smooth stone. This one shaped like a teardrop. And for the first time in years, She wept. Dot, no sound. No gasping. Dot, just tears falling into the dirt. He stood beside her, said nothing, but in that silence, something was planted. Dot, not a child, not a promise, but the idea of staying. The letter came wrapped in twine, sealed with a smear of red wax. Miriam found it nailed to the fence post, just beyond the edge of her land, where her boundary met the world's indifference. No name on the outside, just a folded parchment and the bitter smell of old tobacco clinging to the paper. She read it twice before her hands began to tremble. Dot, it was from her late husband's brother, a man who'd made it known years ago that Miriam was an embarrassment to the family, a barren woman in a fertile bloodline. Now, with her ex-husband dead by fever and no heirs named, the land defaulted to kin. Dot, he was coming. Dot, to take what was rightfully his. No matter that she had worked it, no matter that she'd buried children in its soil. When she told the warrior, she still didn't know his name. He listened, jaw set, hands curling slow and quiet around the mug he held. He didn't interrupt, didn't ask questions. Dot just said, he won't take it? That night, they did not sleep. They sharpened tools, secured the livestock, covered the windows. The land, so still days ago, now felt alert, as if the trees themselves knew something was coming. On the third day, the brother arrived. He came with 2 men, broad-shouldered, lawless in the way men become when they believe the world owes them. They dismounted slow, all boots and cocky smiles, eyes lingering too long on Miriam. The brother tipped his hat like he had manners. You've had your time, girl. Pack your things. She didn't move. The warrior stepped forward. They laughed when they saw him. Just one man, half limping, half dash shadow. One of them spat. Redskin? Thinks he's got teeth. The fight was fast. Not clean. The warrior moved like something unchained, silent and brutal. One man went down with a crack of bone. The other staggered, blood pouring from his nose. The brother reached for a pistol, but Miriam had taken it from the drawer hours ago. She stepped between them, hands steady. You gave me nothing, she said. You don't get to take what I've become. He backed away, not because he feared her, but because he saw something in her that hadn't been there before. The warrior said nothing, but as they left, Miriam turned to him. And asked, finally, what do they call you? He hesitated. Then, Tahlequah. It meant 2 roads. For days, the wind howled over the hills like something lost. Miriam found herself moving differently, not with fear, but with the weight of decision. The threat had passed, but the echo of it stayed, like a bruise on the soul. She walked the land as if each step might be the last. Slept lightly, dreamed of children's laughter she had never heard. Tahlequah repaired the barn door, then painted a symbol on the wood, a curve crossed by 2 lines. She asked what it meant. He touched his chest. It means stay even when it hurts. The garden bloomed in ways it never had. Corn broke through dry soil. The mint spread wild. Flowers she hadn't planted grew near the graves she had once dug with trembling hands. One evening, she brought out a bundle wrapped in old linen, a pair of tiny shoes never worn. I used to believe, she said, voice barely above the crickets, that my body betrayed me. Tahlequah did not interrupt. She set the shoes in the fire, watched them blacken, curl, disappear. He knelt beside her, then placed a hand over hers, not to comfort, not to claim, just to witness. And then from behind, a voice, Ma? They turned. At the edge of the path stood a child, boy, maybe 5, dirt on his face, hair tangled, barefoot and alone, clutching a scrap of canvas, trembling. Miriam's heart stopped. She stepped forward. Where is your family? He shook his head. I don't remember. Tahlequah crouched low, spoke gently in a language softer than wind. The boy didn't understand, but something eased in his posture. They brought him inside, fed him, bathed him. He fell asleep curled at the foot of the cot, like a pup who had finally found shelter. That night, Miriam stood by the window, watching the stars, her hands on the sill, her eyes wet. Behind her, the boy stirred. Then, with a voice rough from sleep, he mumbled, "Mama?" And Miriam broke, not in grief, in something else. THLEQUH crossed the room and wrapped his arms around her, held her as she shook outside. The land breathed. It had rained in the night, and in the morning, everything smelled like forgiveness. By late summer, the land no longer felt hollow. The boy, they called him Eli, ran barefoot through the garden, trailing laughter like pollen. He had no memory of the before, no name for the ache in his eyes when he woke crying in the dark. But Miriam held him each time, humming no songs in particular, only the rhythm of a heart finally put to use. Tahlequah built him a small bed from cedar, quietly, without being asked. Some nights, all three of them would sit beneath the cottonwood, watching the fireflies rise like lost stars. Eli on her lap, Tahlequah seated beside her, his shoulder brushing hers just enough to say, "I'm still here." The wind changed. The heat gave way to the gentler edge of fall. And one morning, as fog laced the field, Miriam planted a row of wildflowers near the sycamore, not over the graves, but beside them. She didn't need to forget. She needed to grow anyway. On the porch, Eli played with stones, the ones Tahlequah still left on her doorstep, each one a word never spoken. She smiled at him, then turned to the man who had become something more than a shadow. "Will you stay?" she asked. He didn't answer right away, just took her hand, placed it over his heart. "You were always enough." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of things once broken, now held gently in hands calloused by survival. Since that morning, the house never echoed with silence again. Would you have believed him if it had been you? Tell us what this story awakened in you. And if you still believe healing comes in quiet ways, subscribe to Silent Ranch. Years passed. Not many, but enough to soften the sharpness of memory. The ranch remained small, untouched by the rush of towns or railroads. Just a patch of land held together by quiet hands and the will to stay. The cottonwood grew taller, the sycamore older. Seasons moved like breath, slow, certain. Eli grew strong and wild-hearted. He called Tahlequah Papa without ever having been told to. Called Miriam Ma like it had always been that way. Sometimes he asked about before. Most times he did single quotes T. One autumn morning, Miriam found him planting marigolds by the graves. "Why flowers?" she asked gently. He looked up. "Because they come back." Tahlequah still spoke little, but his presence filled rooms. His laughter, when it came, was soft and rare, like distant thunder on a clear day. Miriam never asked more of him than he gave, and somehow that made him give everything. Some nights, she'd wake to find him sitting by the fire, wrapped in a blanket, whispering in his language. Not prayers, not laments. Just remembering. She'd sit beside him, neither speaking. They'd hold hands like driftwood found in the same river. One winter, snow came early. Eli carved birds into the frost on the window, saying he'd seen them in a dream. Miriam watched, her heart full in the way only silence can explain. She was no longer barren. She had grown something that no womb ever could, love that stayed. And that was the end of the sorrow, not because it disappeared, but because it no longer ruled her. What would you have planted in her place? Tell us how this story found you, and if you believe that family is sometimes chosen, Subscribe to Silent Ranch.